You're 12 years old, standing in a marketplace in Gaul, and Roman soldiers are walking through the crowd of captives, examining bodies like livestock. Your mother is beside you. Your father is dead, killed 3 days ago when your village resisted. The soldier stops in front of you, lifts your chin, checks your teeth. You don't understand Latin yet, but you understand the calculation in his eyes. He's deciding what you're worth. Your mother starts screaming. She knows what that look means. She's pulled away. You never see her again. Right now, in history textbooks and museum exhibits, Roman military conquest is presented as a story of tactical brilliance, engineering genius, and the spread of civilization. But there's another story that's been systematically sanitized from popular understanding. The story of how the Roman state didn't just permit sexual violence during warfare. It industrialized it, codified it into military law, and transformed rape from a crime into an economic instrument of empire. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over the 6 centuries of Roman expansion, between 2 and 3 million people, overwhelmingly women and children, were subjected to systematic sexual violence as a direct consequence of Roman military policy. This wasn't collateral damage. This wasn't soldiers acting against orders. This was official state practice, regulated by military law, taxed by the state, and celebrated in public triumph ceremonies where the bodies of the conquered were paraded through Rome as proof of victory. Here's what Roman military law actually said, preserved in legal texts and military manuals that survive to this day. Captured enemies became property of the Roman state immediately upon defeat, and that property could be distributed to soldiers as payment for military service. The Latin term is praeda bellica, spoils of war, and Roman law was explicit about what that meant. The Digest of Justinian, compiling centuries of Roman legal precedent, states clearly that captives become slaves by the law of nations, and everything they possess becomes the property of their captors. Everything. Including their bodies. Including their children. Roman military commanders had legal authority to distribute captives to their troops, and what soldiers did with that human property was considered a private matter, not a crime. Let me show you how this worked in practice. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE, his own commentaries record that he enslaved approximately 1 million people. Roman historians celebrated this as a logistical achievement, the efficient processing of conquered populations. But those million people weren't abstract statistics. They were individuals experiencing specific horrors. Contemporary accounts describe how Roman military camps during the Gallic campaigns operated temporary slave markets, where soldiers could immediately sell their captives to traveling merchants, or keep them for personal use. Women and children were separated from men. The men were typically executed or sent to labor camps. The women and children were distributed among the troops. You need to understand what that distribution meant in physical terms. A Roman legion consisted of approximately 5,000 soldiers. After a successful siege, those soldiers would be granted access to the conquered population as reward. Ancient sources describe this with bureaucratic precision. Captives were herded into holding areas, sorted by age and sex, then allocated according to military rank. Centurions received first choice. Common soldiers received what remained. This process wasn't hidden or shameful. It was public, organized, and considered the natural right of conquest. The poet Horace, writing during the reign of Augustus, describes captured women as sweetest prize of military victory, using language that treats sexual access to conquered populations as equivalent to seizing gold or territory. But here's where it gets even more systematic and disturbing. The Roman state didn't just permit this violence, it taxed it. When soldiers sold their captives, the state collected a portion of the sale price. The quinta, a 20% tax on war spoils, applied to enslaved people just as it applied to seized property. The Roman treasury maintained detailed records of these transactions. We have surviving tax documents from provincial administrators tallying the revenue generated from the sale of captives. The sexual violence wasn't incidental to Roman economic policy, it was integrated into it. The state profited directly from the systematic rape and enslavement of conquered populations, and those profits funded further military expansion. Now listen carefully to what this meant for the people experiencing it. You're a 15-year-old girl in a village in Thrace. Roman troops arrive. Your father and brothers attempt to defend the village and are killed. You're captured along with your mother, your younger sisters, all the surviving women and children. You're marched for days to a Roman camp. You haven't eaten. You've been given minimal water. You're terrified, exhausted, and you've watched people die during the march, the elderly, the sick, the very young who couldn't keep pace. At the camp, you're processed, stripped, examined, categorized. A merchant looks you over, checking for disease, for physical defects that would lower your value. You're young enough to be valuable. That's not protection, that's a curse. You're purchased by a soldier who served his term and received land in a Roman colony. You're going to be transported hundreds of miles from everything you've ever known to a place where you don't speak the language, where you have no legal rights, where your body is property. This is the part rarely mentioned in discussions of Roman civilization. The architectural marvels, the legal innovations, the philosophical achievements, all of it was built on a foundation of industrialized human suffering. The Roman villa system, those beautiful rural estates celebrated in art and literature, was staffed almost entirely by enslaved people. Many of them women captured during military campaigns and subjected to reproductive exploitation. Roman agricultural manuals discuss the management of slave populations with the same clinical detachment they use for discussing crop rotation. Codified de Agricultura advises estate owners on the optimal ratio of male to female slaves to ensure natural population increase, recommending that female slaves be mated with male slaves to produce children who would be born into slavery, expanding the owner's property without additional purchase costs. The language matters. Roman sources don't describe rape. They describe use of property. They don't describe victims. They describe acquisitions. This linguistic sanitization wasn't accidental. It was how the Roman elite justified systematic violence to themselves and to history. By transforming people into legal objects, Roman law made it impossible to commit crimes against them. You can't rape property. You can only use it inappropriately, and even that wasn't usually prohibited as long as you owned it. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. Roman triumph ceremonies, the massive public celebrations held when generals returned victorious from campaigns, featured the public display of captives. Contemporary accounts describe how conquered women were paraded through Rome in chains, their bodies displayed as proof of Roman dominance. The triumph of Pompey after his eastern campaigns in 61 BCE included thousands of captive women and children marched through the streets while Roman crowds cheered. This wasn't shameful or hidden, it was entertainment. The sexual availability of these captives was explicitly part of what was being celebrated. Poets wrote about it, artists depicted it, audiences celebrated it. And it continued for centuries. When Titus destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Jewish historian Josephus records that 97,000 people were enslaved. The Arch of Titus in Rome, still standing today, depicts captive Jewish women in chains. Those weren't symbolic images. They were documentary records of actual people who were subjected to exactly what Roman law permitted. The younger women would have been distributed to soldiers, used sexually, then either kept as permanent slaves or sold in markets across the empire. The children would have been raised in slavery, many of them in households where their mothers were simultaneously enslaved and sexually exploited by the same owners. The machinery of this system was vast and efficient. The Roman slave trade operated permanent markets in major cities and temporary markets near military campaigns. Merchants specialized in different categories of captives. Some dealt primarily in strong young men for agricultural or mining labor. Others specialized in women and children for domestic servitude. The distinction wasn't about the type of work, it was about the type of exploitation. Women purchased for domestic service understood exactly what that meant. It meant you were available, always, to the owner, to his sons, to his guests. Resistance meant punishment or death. Compliance meant survival, but not safety. You need to understand the scale. Rome wasn't a small city-state engaging in occasional warfare. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled territory from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Every expansion involved military campaigns. Every campaign involved captives. Every group of captives was processed through the same legal machinery that transformed people into property and violence into legitimate economic activity. The villa you're enslaved in isn't unusual. The treatment you're experiencing isn't exceptional. This is standard practice, replicated across thousands of estates, sustained over centuries, normalized to the point where Roman elites wrote casually about it in their correspondence. Pliny the Younger, considered one of the more humane Roman aristocrats, writes letters discussing his estates and mentions in passing that he's concerned about the breeding of his female slaves, hoping to increase their productivity through reproduction. He's not describing a crime, he's describing estate management. The children born from these forced reproductive arrangements would be his property from birth, sold if convenient, kept if useful. Their mothers had no legal claim to them. The entire apparatus of Roman law was designed to ensure that this exploitation could continue without legal consequence. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. Roman propaganda presented this system as civilizing. Captive populations weren't being brutalized, they were being integrated into superior civilization. Slavery wasn't violence, it was opportunity. This narrative appears constantly in Roman literature. Enslaved people should be grateful for access to Roman culture, Roman language, Roman civility. The sexual exploitation was reframed as domestic integration. The labor extraction was described as education. The systematic destruction of families and communities was presented as the natural consequence of Roman superiority. This ideological framework persisted long after Rome fell. European colonial powers in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, explicitly invoked Roman precedent to justify their own systems of enslavement and sexual violence. The legal language of captives as property was directly adapted from Roman law. The justifications about civilizing missions and cultural superiority were Roman arguments repackaged for new contexts. The industrialized nature of the violence, the bureaucratic processing, the state taxation of human suffering, all of it had Roman precedent, and it's still being sanitized today. Popular media presents Rome as the foundation of Western civilization, emphasizing architecture, governance, and military strategy while systematically erasing the human cost. Movies and television shows depict Roman soldiers as heroic, Roman generals as brilliant, Roman society as admirably organized. The enslaved people are background characters, decorative elements in scenes about power and glory. Their experiences are rarely centered, their pain is rarely acknowledged. The systematic nature of their exploitation is almost never explained. The definitive truth is this: Roman military success wasn't built on tactical superiority alone. It was built on an economic model that weaponized sexual violence, transforming rape from a war crime into a war prize. The state didn't just permit this, it regulated it, taxed it, celebrated it, and encoded it into law so thoroughly that it became invisible as violence. The people who experienced it, millions of them over 6 centuries, weren't abstract victims of ancient warfare. They were specific individuals whose bodies were destroyed by policy decisions made in Rome, whose children were born into the same system, whose suffering generated revenue for the empire and labor for its estates. If you've learned something today about the foundations of Roman power that history classes usually skip, make sure you're subscribed to Mythbusting, because we're going to keep examining the systems of exploitation that built civilizations, the violence that's been rebranded as conquest, and the human costs that get erased from triumphant historical narratives. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the empires we're taught to admire were sustained by industrialized cruelty, and understanding that matters for recognizing how those patterns persist in different forms today. What historical system of exploitation should we examine next? Let me know in the comments.